state are not valid. That's kind of like an anarchist left accelerationist perspective. Both of these kinds of accelerationism are kind of doomer accelerationism, which you'll see a lot of in this video. And the doomer accelerationist variant is more like, I want things to get really bad so that they collapse. Has this ever happened ever in history? It makes sense up here, and that's all that matters. Jreg also spells cac, the part of my body that's massive.
By the way, the thing about Jreg is everything he says is coded in so many layers of irony.
This is a sometimes
it may or may not be
pejorative term
true.
used by accelerationists to refer to like primitivists and like degrowth people who either want to put limitations on technology or get rid of it altogether. EAC is a fission accelerationist, the leader of which Beth Jezos referenced my definition of meta-irony on the Lex Friedman podcast.
To which degree is everybody kind of chanting EAC, EAC, like the sheep in Animal Farm?
Well, first of all, it's fun. It's rebellious, right? Like, you know, many...
He ran for mayor of fucking
I think we lean into...
Or Toronto.
There's this concept of sort of meta-irony, right? Of sort of being on the boundary of, like, we're not sure if they're serious or not, and it's much more playful and much more fun.
That's weird. That's weird every time that happens. Every time that happens, I'm like sitting in bed with my brain turned off watching YouTube videos mindlessly, and then I have to violently repersonalize. Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, who's making like $100 million a month off of ChatGPT, is also claimed to be an efficient accelerationist. So this is not like just a weird random internet ideology believed by 10 people. Well, I mean, it is, but those 10 people have power. It's fucked up. EX stands in contrast to other ideologies that want to regulate tech and slow down tech. Like effective altruists are often very concerned about where technology is going and they want regulations to be placed upon them. Efficient accelerationism is kind of an optimistic variant of that. FAC spells FAC, which is what I say every morning when I realize I'm still here. FAC. It also stands for friendship accelerationism, which is what I'm doing in Toronto. Look at all my friends. I have so many of them now. GAC stands for gender accelerationism. There are a lot of different definitions of gender accelerationism, and I'm going to bring you 3 that I think make sense. One is a culturally left-wing variant of gender accelerationism that wants to accelerate the number of genders that there are in that kind of gender wiki style of like having 50,000 genders until the concept of gender becomes essentially meaningless because everybody has their own hyper-specific gender. Kind of like what Jordan Peterson is warning about, but based actually.
If you take the oppressed, you have to fractionate them and fractionate.
This is kind of like an accelerationist, gender abolitionist take, if that makes any sense. A second definition seeks to identify all non-male identifying persons as female so that the female part of the gender spectrum becomes powerful enough to overthrow the male end of the gender spectrum because the male end is like the patriarchy and stuff. And then there's a third definition, which I believe is more descriptive, but I think is actually pretty accurate. Basically, it's the idea that men and women are getting more and more divided and extreme. And this is represented by like male-to-male transsexuals, female-to-female transsexuals, men reading stuff about how women are bad, women reading stuff about how men are bad. You know, like both sides start analyzing each other's mating patterns. Men are like, oh, women like it when you do this and that. And then the women are like, oh, men are trying to do this and that. And it's just like an arms race of sex. To accelerate this war between the sexes, we can imagine an endpoint where men and women become so hostile and non-communicative towards each other that they just have gender states. All the men live together, all the women live together, and then all the mating gets done during the cover of night. Maybe there's a third gender state for NBs, I don't know. GAC also spells GAC, which is the sound of you choking.
Well, that's something I'd get into, is the idea that where some people are like, now there's more data than ever before, and that makes it scary because you don't know what's real. But I would say that before, the people who were telling you what was real were wrong and all liars. And so now, at the very least, there's an even playing field. You know, like now there's so much data that nobody knows what's real, but in that same prerogative, it's also more likely to stumble onto the idea that nobody knows what's real. And from there, then we get more people knowing that nobody knows what's real. And I think if we're going to accelerate past that paradigm, then that's a good starting point, because once you know that you don't know what's real, then that leads you to realize that other people also don't know what's real. And if you can realize that other people also can realize that as well as yourself, then you can sort of start communicating and realizing, hey, we're all just stupid aliens. everything's subjective. I would say perspective is intrinsic. I think the idea of objective reality is a thought plague that I've unsubscribed to, and my life has been better off for it. Yeah, I mean, there's baselines thing like you can prove I think therefore I am to a certain degree. This thought, it proves itself. I exist in this moment, deciding that I exist. And then you get the Boltzmann brain paradigm where it's like technically everything could have just assembled in the right configuration to make a brain pattern that seems to perceive this reality right here and now. Well, I'd agree with that for the most part, and I will say what you're talking about is like the most like because like there's the date like for example when I'm looking at what's in front of me, I'm assuming that the light that enters into my eyes isn't lying to me. I'm assuming that my eyes are actually because the most consistent form of reality has basically been what my sensory perception tells me, right? Like the ground is under me, like so far I like every time and here's something to think about, right? When you dream, you go into different realities, right? But every time you wake up, you come back into something that's vaguely similar. So there's something. All I'm saying is there's something to be said of like when you're awake versus like the waking reality seems to be more consistent and linear with what other people experience. Yeah, and so like I'd say, there's reasonable assumptions we can make. Like I'm assuming, like for example, like while I can't know for like there's always the possibility that I'm just in a simulation that the meat world, what I'll call meat space, isn't like actually meat space, and that's just bullshit. That's big, but that's not really worth assuming because that's well, I mean, the school of physics is about determining like yeah, I think when you're talking about physical realities, that's a good term for it. Um, the practical study of what could be considered like plausibly the axiom of a universal constant. Like you can't actually see the universal constant, but we can assume a universal constant that's pretty similar and consistent. Yeah, and so like based on that assumption of a universal constant, like I don't know what is real for sure, but I can assume that at the very least something is real, and I'm seeing some of it. So we're yeah, no. This is good. This is a good way to. This is why I'm streaming is because we pause the videos and we have interesting conversations based on it.
On my cat. After 15 seconds of research, I found out that hack means human accelerationism, human body accelerationism. This is 5 people on Twitter.com, which is 4 people more than I normally have for my citations. So be grateful for that.
Actually, this one. Let me show you a different one because we already got something out of this. I want to show you a more wide spectrum of Jreg's videos. You don't necessarily have to watch the whole thing. He's been going for a while. Like he has videos about post-dar. Oh, there is one I want to show you in particular. Now that I think about it, it's the one where he explains all the. I gotta find it. Oh wait, actually, this isn't even the one I was talking about. But this one is short, and it's what he was talking. He referenced it in the other video, so I'll just.
I'm trans. I always knew when I was younger that I wasn't really like everybody else. I didn't fit in, and I feel like part of the reason I didn't fit in was because I wasn't matching up with my gender identity. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I didn't see what I felt like on the inside. Outside, my arms would look skinny, spaghetti-like, but on the inside, I am and always have been 300 pounds of raw muscle. I am a hulking, steroidal, transhuman abomination. I'm a male-to-male transsexual, and it feels so good to finally be able to say it. I am what you would call a male to more male transsexual, lowercase m to uppercase m, for sure. You see, as someone who's recently put on 5 to 10 pounds of muscle, the algorithm seems to think that I want to become just like a hulking creature beyond the pale of what is human. As a result, the standard of what a man is in my head has become extremely skewed, and now I have genuine dysphoria. It may be helpful to redefine the gender spectrum like a horseshoe. Over here we have uppercase F, which are enhanced hyper-female Stacy genders. Here we have lowercase f, which are unenhanced females, Becky's, femcells, lowercase m, which is soy boy gremlin genders, and of course uppercase M, which is what I am. Basically the average bodybuilder influencer.
This is gender
it's okay
acceleration, isn't
because
it?
they're open about the steroid use. In the middle here we have non-binary people, but then as we approach the intersection point of the horseshoe here, we just get general post-human abomination vibes. And both are not affiliated with either gender, so that's interesting.
I want to
this
be
kind
a
of
post-human
trans is really more
abomination. That's the
transhuman than
sexiest
anything
one.
else. I think we should measure transness by the distance
I
someone
already
travels
is.
along the gender line, rather than whether or not they just cross an arbitrary barrier. Some masculine-looking chick
I'm
trying to
changing
become
my brain with
non-binary is
chemicals.
only moving about half a space down from lowercase f to
I'm a
non-binary.
chemical transhumanist.
Meanwhile, someone who's just barely a man trying to go from barely a man to a hyper-masculine abomination, that's like a huge jump. That person is more trans.
See, a lot of trans people, they're doing it with just like estrogen and testosterone, but me, I'm doing it with like serotonin and dopamine. There's different chemicals and hormones they're all hormones. You can influence this chemical structure of your brain to be different directions.
It's funny because we're like kind of like all alchemists playing with the supposed rules of what you cannot do.
Well, there's no rule. I wouldn't say there's anything. But I like the alchemist take. We're definitely alchemists playing with the structures. Maybe the structures is a better word. The foundations, the once you
More like human alchemists, like brain alchemists.
yes.
There's obviously not any actual rules. We're mostly like, holy shit, the one thing you can't do in this novel is try to rewrite your own brain. But man, we are doing that. Let's fuck that.
If anybody says that you can't do that, then they are denying you one of the most fundamental things that makes you human above an animal. Because that is literally what makes humans cool. That is literally like the ability that gives you the, like, you can sculpt your own brain and your own reality. Like, you don't have to fucking just accept what is.
Yeah, no, I agree with that 100%. I mean, there's things you can't change, like how you like look physically, but you can change who you are in terms of your brain, absolutely.
And you can change how you look physically to a certain degree. I mean, so
Yeah, but I can't ever be like 6'2", for example.
I mean, like, if you tried really, if you,
I don't have to have those things, obviously. I'm fine without them.
you could hypothetically. I mean, it's just yeah. You want to go on this rack? You ever seen the rack?
Yeah, also like breaking your bones and moving it a little bit. Yeah, I think there is a way to get yourself taller, but I would never do that. That's just not worth it.
Well, you know how those monks punch trees to microfracture their wrists so the bones grow back stronger? What if you just like started pulling your bones slowly so they regrew, and instead of like breaking them all apart, you just like started like stretching them to the point where they were like almost breaking, but then like you keep it stretched for just long enough that they heal, and then you stretch a little more and then they heal a little more. And then you'd have to do this over a period of probably like months or years.
You know, it's just not fucking.
Plausible.
Yeah, no. If I'm gonna change anything, I'm gonna get like a few acne scars once I stay with somebody. But I might not even do that because they're not that big.
I mean, there's nothing wrong. Scars are cool. Scars are just like tell your story.
Acne scars, but it's not that big.
You could get tattoos. I like tattoos are cool. I fucking, you can be whatever you want. Think of your body as a canvas. It's just like a fucking. I can't let the dog out. He wants to go out. Okay,
Because my view of gender roles is entirely shaped by the internet, I assume muscle equals man, so more muscle equal more man, and testosterone equal man, so more testosterone equal more man. As a result, I am considering now going on gender-affirming therapy.
I took
for
estrogen.
becoming more of a man. Tongkat Ali, boron to reduce my sex hormone binding globulin. Well, that's actually mainly as an adjunct to the 1 gram of tren I'm injecting into my eyeball weekly. Taking gender-affirming hormones can really be life-saving. That's why I'm going to become this guy. I never had the courage to do something like this before.
A progesterone.
But now that I'm comfortable with my gender identity, I think I'm ready.
I was also doing a lot of other blah, blah, blah. How do you rate this video on a scale of 1 to autism? Or on a scale of schizophrenia to autism?
Probably autism-ish, but not quite.
Hold on, let me show you the autism schizophrenia spectrum.
The thing with that is that autism is more about like order, schizophrenia is more about
Chaos. Yes.
I mean, I'm both logical and creative, so I guess in that way I can kind of
Part 1, the only important divide between people. In my last video, we talked about how mental illnesses can be expressed as excess of certain personality spectrums. That video was only made so that I could make this video. And realistically, I could have made a lot more videos laying the groundwork for this video, but I decided, let's just jump right into it. I stopped talking about politics partially because I realized that the left-right divide was not an effective way of speaking about the differences between people, and that a far more effective way of expressing that difference was not through any kind of political divide at all. In fact, the only relevant spectrum that exists, period, is the following. It is a spectrum between 2 mental illnesses that you may not know are connected. It is autism and schizophrenia. The autism-schizophrenia spectrum is perhaps the most important spectrum. It's a spectrum that goes back to the very dawn of time and human history, and also it relates to all of the following spectrums: dopamine and serotonin, verticality versus laterality, depth versus width, innovation versus iteration, creativity versus stability, yin and yang, male and female, introversion versus extroversion. Now, I am going to frame this lens as an excess of openness to experience contrasted. Now, I say an excess implies bad. Mental illnesses are good, of course, and you should aim to be mentally ill. A lot of people call me a mental health advocate, and it kind of annoys me because I'm not a mental health advocate. I advocate for having mental illness. I'm not sure where they're getting this from. So, openness to experience can be described as the fundamental battle between autism and schizophrenia. And this, my friends, this is the only relevant divide in any kind of spectrum that you can use to divide people. Throw out all your other personality models. Myers-Briggs, trash. Political compass, throw it in the garbage. This is all you need. Now, when I talk about autism and schizophrenia, I'm not really talking about the medical terms, although I kind of am, but really we're talking about the way that people use terms like autistic and schizophrenic to refer to certain patterns of thinking. Because we're using these terms a lot, I've noticed, and I don't think we're just saying them without knowing what they mean. I think we know what they mean, and I'm just trying to elucidate and maybe better describe what it is that we're talking about when we use terms like autistic or schizophrenic. Part 2, neurodivergence and openness to experience. Neurodivergence is basically the idea that autistic people, rather than being mentally ill as we understand them, a better word for them is neurodivergent, because they think differently in a way that neurotypical people think, but the way that they think differently could provide them certain advantages in certain ways that our world just doesn't recognize. This could seem like a cope. It could seem like people who are inherently inferior are trying to justify their existence. But when you start to think about it, they're right. Autism actually is a form of neurodivergence. What they miss is that on the other end of the spectrum, there's another form of neurodivergence that I call schizotypy. Schizotypal people are more likely to believe in weird, mystical beliefs, right? Things that don't make sense to the average person because some weird lateral connection has been made in their head between two unrelated topics and just won't unstick. And sometimes these lateral connections form in very weird ways. I mean, you could get someone who unironically thinks that you need to align all political extremes to help each other out in order to defeat the centrists, which is something that nobody else believes.
I say schizotypal, but a better word for it is just schizo, because that encompasses schizoids, schizophrenics, and schizotypals, all in that big cluster A. So yes, it's the schizo-autism spectrum.
Now look, I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not telling you that to discount what I'm about to say. I'm telling you that as a flex. Because the psychiatrists haven't figured this out. It's just me. I'm gonna reference studies in this to prove my point, but you should probably know that I looked for those studies to prove my point. So it's really just aesthetic. For example, here's a study that shows that different kinds of inflammation during the fetal stage affect what kind of mental illness you'll get on the autism schizophrenia spectrum. And if you have a form of like quick inflammation that happens like early on and damages you quickly, you get autism. If you have prolonged inflammation, then you get schizophrenia. And that seems to make sense because you're born with autism, but schizophrenia manifests as your brain takes more and more inflammation damage over time. Hence, when I was 14, I got front page on the Scratch website for computer programming. And now, at 24, I hear voices. Here's another study that says that autism is essentially an overproduction of a male gene, and that schizophrenia is essentially an overproduction of a female gene. More specifically, autism is like blocking the thing that limits the overproduction of the male gene. And schizophrenia, vice versa, it's blocking the overproduction of the thing that makes the female gene. So you're more likely to have the overproduction of that female gene. Women are higher in openness to experience than men. I rest my case. It's all coming together now, isn't it?
Part 3, vertical versus lateral thinking.
Autistic people tend to be better at what I call vertical thinking. These are people who can dig really deep into a subject. And the deeper they go into that subject, the more they flesh out their understanding and knowledge about a particular subject. Trains, that's the meme, right? An autistic person could know...
So what he's getting at here is actually something that I would break down into obsessive thinking versus chronic non-obsessive. Like if you think about OCD versus ADHD, you have in a hyperactive or really just ADD. Forget the hyperactivity. In an attention. Yeah, well, I'm not. It's not either or. These are different things that what we're categorizing. It's So what? Yeah. Well, what I'm trying to say is that what he's categorizing now, what he's about to categorize as schizophrenia and autism, I'd actually think about more as attention deficit versus obsessive compulsive. But I want to go further, because what is an attention deficit disorder? It is when you want to pay attention to something but cannot. So think about when you are trying to think about a subject but you can't bring yourself. So when I think about attention deficit disorders, there are multiple reasons for having attention deficit. In certain cases, it could be serotonin depression. It could be dopamine depression. Depression can be lead to forms of attention deficit. However, another thing that can lead to attention deficit is the opposite of depression, which is overstimulation. When you have excessive agonizing, like think when you take too much Adderall or like too much. So there's these multiple categories and these multiple spectrums that affect each other back and forth, like a bandwidth. Yeah, and that's what I'm trying to say is I don't think any of these disorders are necessarily as chronic. Like they can be chronic for some people. Like if you have a chronic I have a point. If you have a chronic schizophrenia disorder, then you are chronically predisposed to breaking the rails. Basically, somebody who has a schizophrenia disorder cannot over time their reality will become more and more abstract. Because it doesn't like the patterns aren't lining up. They're basically vaguely associating. Like instead of going like pipe to hand because my pipe is in my hand, it would go pipe to ruler because I don't even know why. I just came up with ruler as an abstract association, and then pipe to and if you're looking at your hand, like eventually you build networks of abstract associations. So this is also why like if you manifest schizophrenia later in life, it's easier to deal with, because if you already have a consistent framework built up. And then you can, and you become basically disattached. You lose the process of associating. So chronic schizophrenic disorder is not the same thing as a schizophrenic thought process. And this is my main point, because anybody Anybody can use a schizophrenic thought process, like I just did. I could associate pipe to ruler. But the difference between me and a chronic schizophrenic is that I don't do this unintentionally. I have to do it on purpose.
Well, that's, no, I mean, I get what you're saying, and that does sound likely that these, like, vision, like, categories of disorder are kind of, like, they're not reflecting what's necessarily all actually going on, which is, like, chemicals in the brain, like serotonin and dopamine being too much going through, too little going through, and I think it makes more sense to look at it through what's going on in the brain, but that's hard to afford, of course.
Well, we're starting to register terms tonight. This is why we're talking about it, because the more we talk about it, the more of a framework we can have for transcoding this data.
Yeah, I mean, would you agree that it makes more sense to look at it in terms of like what's actually going on in the brain than like what disorder apparently is?
Well, the reason I'm starting out with a framework of disorders is because it's not disorder. You can have no, I know, but listen, because when I'm saying the reason I'm categorizing schizophrenia versus a schizophrenia disorder is because the word schizophrenia can work by itself without the disorder. Like, we can use this term to register a specific type of thought process. In the same way we can an attention deficit thought process. For example, if we're talking about it, and the way that this might work is if somebody has a diagnosed attention deficit disorder, instead of just treating them, what you'd go in is and you'd ask, well, what is causing your attention deficit? Is it a depressive thought process? Or are you having trouble focusing on things you care about? Are you having trouble caring about things that you want to focus on? These are different dimensions of it.
Yeah, sometimes you can only focus on what you care about.
And it's easier to focus on things. This is why I was misdiagnosed as having an attention deficit hyperactive disorder, when in actuality I think I had dyslexia because I couldn't fucking read until third grade. But like the thing was, like I never really I mean I actually did end up learning to read because I did end up caring about it, and it was just took a fucking long time. But uh, the thing was I didn't do well in school, and I didn't want to do well in school because no one tried to convince me that it was worth it. So I never actually, So they and then they gave me the pills, and they saw that the test scores went up. And that went up because it was basically when you're on amphetamines, it forces you to care about things, and it makes it really easy to care about things. So it's like even if I was giving it a half-assed amount of attention, obviously it would be a little bit easier, but I was still half-assing it. And so the problem was I didn't want to be helped, and they kept forcing that help onto me, right? And I'm just using myself as an example because this is my experience that I'm learning from. And so what's interesting about that is I didn't even have an attention deficit disorder, but you can take these drugs for things like an attention deficit disorder. And the reason that I think actually Adderall might help someone with a legitimate attention deficit hyperactive disorder is because they might have a dopamine depressive disorder. They might have chronic dopamine depression, which, by the way, is something I now have because they put me on those pills. Well, yeah, but when you think about chronic depression, traditionally they're talking about serotonin depression, which is one form of depression. So that's another problem is that in the current clinical diagnoses, there's not really terminologies for different terms of chemical depression, and there's also terms for like oversensitivity. Hypersensitivity is another term we can look at because like certain people might have an excess of certain chemicals causing mania, causing all sorts of things that may or may not be. And sometimes these disorders aren't. Sometimes these aren't disorders. Like you can be manic and it can be very helpful for you if you know how to use it. But if you're manic all the time and you can't control it, then it becomes a disorder. So like a hypomania disorder is something I would characterize. These are all new terminologies I'm laying down. For if I was to write the DSM, I would write it like this. Well, I mean, when you talk about consciousness, it's like a soup of reactions, right? Because there's many chemical, and the thing is, your thoughts are made of chemicals, and when you think thoughts, those thoughts influence the chemicals themselves. So literally, by thinking, by imagining, that is an action, a literal. You expend calories to burn electricity to sculpt your neurons, and thought is an action. So every time you're thinking, you're changing the equation. No, no, I'm saying that dopamine depression is a type of depression. No, no, depression isn't one thing, is what I'm saying. There is serotonin depression, there's dopamine depression. I'm sure there's all sorts of depression. No, if it's dopamine depression, then you have and in this case, like I have a dopamine depression issue, a chronic dopamine depression issue. This is the terminology I'd use for it, and because I don't get enough dopamine without drugs, and this is because they, by the way, I wasn't born with this. I don't think. I think this is because I was pilled from an early age, and when I went off the pills, it left my brain with a signaling issue. It basically they trained my brain to have an excess of dopamine, and because I without the pills it doesn't have as much of as much dopamine agonization. You just don't basically, and so if I want to get dopamine, I can do a lot of things to stimulate. I can eat sugar. I could take pills. I can run. I can if I'm in a new environment, that'll change. That'll stimulate dopamine a lot. Oh, and environmental triggers are a big thing too, because if you find yourself in a new environment, your brain will be less predisposed to react, and that's a really good way of like getting over a lot of issues and working on trauma, which is a whole other category. Beep. I'm hungry. I am hungry. Would you mind breaking for lunch? Perhaps we could continue this later. I think that if I end the stream here, we just had a really productive conversation. Yeah, because there's a lot of stuff to let sink in. I'm gonna end it here.